Chapter 27, Section 1. When the United States joins World War II, there's going to be various strengths and weaknesses exhibited by each side. Let's start off by taking a look at the Axis power strengths. One of the big strengths that they had was they were in firm control of vast areas of land. And in order to take all of this land back, it's going to take a long, drawn-out fight to do that. Also, they were simply better prepared for war. During the 1930s, when everybody else was worried about the Depression and avoiding war, the Axis powers had spent the 30s converting their economies towards the military. So when World War II breaks out, they're already hitting the ground running. Axis power weaknesses, though. One of the big weaknesses here is going to be the fact that they are spread over a vast area in Europe and the Pacific. For example, the Nazis had to fight on two fronts. They had to fight the British and the Soviets. And, it really weakens their military because they have to spread it out over such a large area. The Allies, their hopes rely on two things. Number one, the gigantic Soviet military. Good or bad, it was going to take quite a bit to defeat the Soviet military because it was so huge. Also, the production capacity of us. When we need to produce, we can produce. And so the Axis leaders were hoping to hurry up and win this war before they got overwhelmed by those two factors. The Allies, on the other hand, they were hoping they could hold out until we can get involved. So let's look after Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, so we're going to enter this war. One of the first things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to convert from a peacetime to a wartime economy. I mean, you're going to see things like no strike agreements brought forth. The government and private sectors willing and agreeing to work together. And there's going to be a huge boom in production. One of the ways you could see that was by looking at the number of people employed in arms production. In 1940, before we're in the war, that number's 22,000 people in the United States employed in arms production. Within 3 years, that number's approaching 500,000. We're going to produce a lot. By the end of this war, here's what we've produced. A ridiculous amount of items. If we're going to produce this much, though, you're going to have the factories to do this. And you're going to see these huge factories being built. And one of the worries was these would be a target. What if the Japanese came and sent bombers over here? What if the Nazis came on the East Coast? And so what you're going to see is these factories had to be camouflaged. There's a picture of the exact same factory camouflaged. You can't even see the factory. Let me show you a little closer how that was done. They used these tarps, they made it look like hills and houses and trees, and they covered all of this up. Up close, sure, you could tell. But if you were an enemy bomber, you couldn't tell. That looked like farmland. It was this boom that's going to help to end the Great Depression. Unemployment by 44 was down to 1.2%. I mean, that is ridiculously low. That's a number that we'll be lucky if we ever see that number again. Between 39 and 45, the amount of money people made, the earnings had doubled. Those struggling sharecroppers, those tenant farmers, they could now find good jobs. They could move to where the factories were. They could move to where the shipyards were. Farms were increasing their productivity. They had to produce enough for us here, but they also had to produce enough for our allies. I mean, 10% of food was pretty much automatically sent to Great Britain and the Soviet Union due to the Lend-Lease Act. The government has to expand to run the country more effectively during the war, which leads to a triple in the number of government employees. We needed to make as much as possible of military goods. And so you're going to start seeing some different boards created to help make sure we are producing what we need to produce. You had the War Production Board created in January of 1942. They were the ones that directed the conversion of existing factories to war production. If you were a factory that could be converted, if you already made, a car, you could be converted into making some kind of a military vehicle, for example. They supervised building new factories if we needed more factories, which we did. They determined which industries got certain raw materials. You had to make sure it goes where it was most needed at the time. Basically, they're helping to increase military production. You also saw the creation of the Office of War Mobilization, the OWM. This organization, this office, is going to be headed up by James Burns. Jokingly, he was sometimes called the assistant president due to the extreme power that he had at the head of this office. This is the office that coordinated all the government agencies involved in the war effort. They could order production and distribution of even consumer goods. It was during World War II that you saw, for example, you couldn't buy nylons. They couldn't make nylons, pantyhose, because they needed the nylons to make parachutes. They could regulate clothing styles to save fabric. No cuffs in pants, no pleats in the skirts. Those are just a fashion thing. There's no actual purpose to them. They're a look thing, and it just wastes material. The government was gaining more control of the economy because we needed more and more money to finance this war. This war was going to be very expensive. Part of that's going to come through the fact that more Americans were paying income tax now, because in the 30s, people weren't working. What tax would you be paying if you don't have an income? Now people were working, so that increases money for the government. Also, you had borrowing through war bonds, like we had during World War I. These bonds would help keep inflation down. They gave people something to spend their money on and a way to help out the war effort. You had the creation of the Office of Price Administration. They would set the maximum price on consumer goods. That way, people, stores, whoever couldn't just rip you off because they're like, well, people need this, we're going to jack up the price. They couldn't do that. They also controlled rationing. We had to make sure we didn't run out of things. 13 different rationing programs were held at the height. Gas, tires, coffee, sugar, meat, butter, canned goods, all these different things could be rationed. And you had to have a ticket to make sure you could buy it. If you used your ticket for the week or the month, depending on what it was, you couldn't buy more of that. The larger the family, the more tickets you had. But it made sure everybody got their fair amount. This is fine, our economy and everything. But if we're going to win this war, we're going to need a military force, and we got to raise that military force. The Selective Training and Service Act is going to go into effect. This is going to be even the first peacetime draft, because this technically began in 1940 before the war was even declared by us. And all men between the ages of 21 and 35, later on that'll be changed to 18 to 45, had to register with their local boards. And if your number came up, a local board would determine if you were fit. You could be deferred for a variety of reasons. Sometimes family reasons. If you were the only income earner in the family, they weren't going to take you away. Could be religious reasons, could be health reasons, but there are a variety of reasons that you could be deferred. And in the first year of the draft, half of all men failed. We weren't just going to take anybody. We wanted people who could be soldiers. So there were certain minimums even that had to be met. For example, men, you had to be at least 5 foot tall. If you weren't, you were ineligible. You had to be at least 105 pounds. You had to have at least correctable vision. You couldn't have flat feet. And you had to have at least 16 of your own natural teeth. Otherwise, you fail. At the beginning of the draft, the approximate size of our military was not going to be enough to win this war. Add that all together, and you're talking somewhere around 500,000 soldiers total. The military estimates to win this war were we were going to need 12 million soldiers. So in World War II, 2/3 of Americans serving in the war were drafted. The other third of our soldiers volunteered. Around 300,000 women volunteered to go help, a variety of different ways. You had the WAC, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. You had the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. You had other auxiliary branches where women could serve. You know, they could be nurses, they could be drivers, they could ferry planes. So that way the men could fight rather than transporting equipment back and forth from the U.S.